My name's Raymond, and for most of my career I've worked as a technical writer. But in 2015 I was given the opportunity, a great opportunity, to work as a system verification engineer, a system tester at Nokia, working on a core network product. And the first 7 months went great. I was doing all kinds of interesting things. I was doing automated testing, I was doing manual testing, I was in the lab pulling out cables, restarting network components, all kinds of stuff. And then I suffered a setback. I suffered a system failure of my own. I had a burst appendix. So as I lay there in the hospital, I asked my girlfriend to bring me something light to read, something fun, something that would take my mind off things. And she brought me this book, which is The Foundations of Software Testing by Rex Black and others. So with nothing else to do, nothing else to read, I started reading the book and I really got into it. And I started to ask myself this question about whether some of the concepts, some of the software testing techniques mentioned in this book could be applied to user documentation. And today I would like to share some of these questions and observations with you. But to put it into some kind of context, I'm going to talk about the 7 principles of software testing from pages 9 to 14 of the book. And I'm sure everybody here knows what these principles are, but what I'll do is I'll review each principle and then see whether it can be applied in some way to user documentation. So let's jump straight in with principle number 1. Software testing can show the presence of faults, not their absence. So I think a good parallel is with fishing. If you fish all day and you don't get any bites, it doesn't necessarily mean there are no fish in the lake. And it's just the same obviously with software testing. If just because all your tests pass, you cannot say for sure that there are no defects in your software. So can we apply this to user documentation? Well, obviously we can. We can show that a procedure, a documented procedure, is incorrect. We can show that a range of values documented for a particular parameter is incorrect. But never mind how many reviews we do, how much user documentation testing we do, we can't say that there are no defects in our documentation. And closely related to this is a principle 2. Exhaustive testing is impossible. Christian Kastner, a computer scientist at Carnegie Mellon University, calculated that to test every possible input to the Linux kernel would take more test cases than there are atoms in the universe. So it's clear we can only test a subset of the possible number of test cases. Can this be applied to documentation? I would say it can on 2 levels. The first level is the testing of the documentation itself. Say, for example, we have a product that has a command line interface. We can't test every procedure. We can't test every parameter for every value of that parameter, for every step, for every procedure in our documentation. Just like the software, we can only test a subset. But I'd say there's another level to this. I would say that exhaustive documentation itself is impossible. We can't document every possible use case for our software. We can't document every possible workflow that our customers might dream up for our software. And I think even to attempt to document everything would result in documentation that's very bulky, that's difficult to search, difficult to maintain, and of course difficult to test. Principle 3, early testing is good. The IBM System Science Institute calculated that defect found in production is 7 times more expensive to fix than one found during the testing phase, and 100 times more expensive to fix than one found in the requirement specification phase. So clearly there's a financial incentive, if nothing else, to test early. And with documentation, it's exactly the same. Ideally, we should be writing the documentation at the same time as the software development teams are actually developing that particular software component. And this has 2 advantages. First advantage is that the documentation and the software component can be tested at the same time. And the second advantage is that if the technical writer has any questions for the engineers, for the system architects, it's very much easier to ask them while it's fresh in their mind. I think there's nothing worse than asking a software engineer a question about code that they wrote days or weeks or months ago. Principle 4, software defects occur in clusters. So this is the Pareto principle that 80% of the defects occur in 20% of the code. So clearly, if we can identify the 20% of the code which has the defects, design test cases for it, we can increase the probability of finding some defects. And it's exactly the same for user documentation. I think anybody who's worked on any kind of documentation, whether it be test plans or requirement specifications or user documentation, I'm sure you will have experienced the case where there will be one or two documents that are problematic, documents that have a lot of defects, documents that get a lot of complaints, either from your external or internal customers. Principle 5, the pesticide paradox. So that's the situation. If you just run the same test cases for each release, the same few test cases over and over again, eventually you'll find no new defects. And I would say that this applies to user documentation, again, on two levels. The first level would be the actual testing of documentation. If you just test one or two procedures each release, the installation instructions and a few other procedures, eventually you'll find no more defects. But again, there's another aspect to documentation, and I think that refers to documentation reviews. If you review a particular problematic part of a document with the same reviewers over and over again, a kind of reviewer fatigue sets in, and those reviewers will stop finding defects. In fact, they'll stop reading the document. Principle 6, software testing is context dependent. Well, clearly, the amount of testing that we do for, say, a medical imaging machine or an air traffic control system is very, very much greater than what we would do for, say, testing a company intranet. And it's exactly the same for user documentation. If you have a documented procedure that if the customer gets it wrong, it can corrupt your hard drive or it can cause a system outage, clearly we have to test that. We have to review it and test it much more than we would, say, a procedure for changing the font size in the user interface. And lastly, my favorite, which is principle 7, the absence of errors fallacy. Just because we don't find any more faults in our software, just because our customers aren't raising any issues about the software, it doesn't necessarily mean that the software is any good. It could be that the customers have got so cheesed off with that particular functionality, they're not using it. They're actually using a rival product, or they're using a workaround, or even worse, they're using your software incorrectly and don't even realize it. Can this be applied to user documentation? Yes, it can. I have heard of situations where the customers aren't raising any complaints about a document because they couldn't find the document. I've heard of situations where the customers aren't raising complaints about the document because they didn't know that the document existed. So that's a quick run-through of the seven principles of software testing. So that's just 5 pages of this very thin book. And we can see that all of these principles, I think, apply pretty well to user documentation. And it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to see that other software testing techniques from this book and from others could be applied to the testing of user documentation. I think all that's needed is a bit of imagination and a bit of cooperation between the testers, software engineers, and the technical writers. Thank you very much.